Good morning, folks. Good afternoon. So, my name's Alex Stanhope. I used to work for Skybinian Gaming. I no longer work for Skybinian Gaming. I have no ties or no shares in Skybinian Gaming, and they've given me a really big microphone. So just imagine how much fun that could be. I think there was a risk taken in bringing back a former employee and giving them this platform. And I want to applaud that risk, because what I'm about to talk about is all about risk. I'd like to encourage all of you to join me in this, because in this presentation I could happily talk in front of my slides for the 26 minutes or so we've got left, but I don't think that's the most value. It is my crutch. I can hide behind it. I've got my speaker notes. I can rehearse it, all of that kind of stuff. And yet I won't really talk about the toxicity that plagues technology working environments if I hide behind it. So I'm going to take some chances. I hope that's okay. I'm going to encourage you to take some chances, because I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and then say any questions. And my hope is that we can fill whatever time we have left with a really good debate about this stuff, because getting underneath toxic environments is all about questions. It's all about interrogating it. It's all about challenging it and saying, not here. So the talk was billed as non-toxic working environments. The original title was Avoiding Toxic Working Environments, and the two are quite different, because this is a non-toxic working environment. I don't think anyone would disagree that a non-toxic working environment sounds fantastic. We all want them. They sound great. It's like saying, yes, I'll have non-carcinogenic water, please, today, or a smoke-free environment. But they're a bit mythical. They're a bit far away. They're a bit distant. Achieving one sounds like a sort of Herculean labor, sort of a bit unreachable. Hercules here clearly played, a chap in the middle, played by Alan Sugar, I thought. So this talk is about avoiding them. It's about spotting them. It's about doing things to deconstruct them, doing things to change them. I think they exist everywhere. And part of the reason I wanted to highlight Skybinian Gaming is that no organization that I've worked for in the last 30 years has been able to escape some aspect of what I'm about to talk about. And you know what the single key criterion for it is? The best indicator for a toxic working environment? Brilliance. If you get brilliant people together and you give them stuff to do, the stuff that surrounds that and the nature of who we are as human beings means that if we're not careful, we can all fall into behaviors and activities that can make it difficult for us to come to work with each other. It sounds crazy, and yet there's something about people at the top of their game, and it works in any sector. I don't know if anyone saw the documentary about Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos documentary. She was a founder of a Silicon Valley company, and it came up in exactly that. If you weren't doing well at the company, and you weren't performing, or you started to raise concerns about the toxicity of the environment, and as I understand it, there was some serious fraud going on in the organization that was actually testing patient samples in a way that may or may not, depending on the outcome of this trial that I think is happening now, proved to have been fraudulent. And people didn't speak up. It was toxicity to the extent that if you want to play our game, you're going to come and be in our company and work to our rules, and you better not say anything about anything you see that's wrong. So speaking up and saying something and questioning it is how we get this stuff healed. It's how we get this stuff improved. So, naturally occurring, by the way, I have some speaker notes. I can't see them, so I'm literally going a little bit blind on this. I hope you'll bear with me. Everyone is involved in it, and belief matters. Stress is good for you. Bit of a conjecture, not all stress is good for you, but some stress is good for you. Some medical studies, admittedly done in rats, showed neurogenesis in stressed rats, that they literally formed new mental patterns as a result of the stress, and which were positive and constructive and allowed them to do the task better. Targeting of immune response, stress can actually make your, rats again, T cells go to the right place so that viruses get fought more effectively. Stressing muscles as part of a typical training regime, so whether you're an Olympic athlete or a very lame gym goer like me, the behavior is the same. You stress the muscle, it gets stronger, and over time, you get fitter and healthier and so on. Toxicity, however, is bad for you, and it's bad because it is a different kind of stress. It causes adverse effects, and these are very variant from person to person. Adverse effects of stress have been fairly well documented. There's a link here. All this stuff is open source if you want to see anything or go into more detail. It's all on the web and linked. The effects I'm talking about are bad. They lead to often absenteeism from work, not enjoying work, some of what Will and Rachel were talking about earlier on. And incidentally, the point about taboo, I completely agree with, because when stuff becomes a taboo, we stop talking about it. And it's that stopping of talking about it that does the damage. I've actively sought out counselling for the last 15 years of my career, and almost every time I've conquered my imposter syndrome, it's been because I didn't listen to those voices, but I acknowledged them and I got help to deal with them. And that's given me the chance to be here today to do this kind of stuff. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What we're talking about when we talk about the damage of a toxic environment is going to affect some part of this pyramid. Now, I think there are very few working environments, and I'm certain very few of them in the evolved tech sector, where you're going to be affected by toxicity that will cause this kind of damage. I don't imagine that any tech organization would deprive its staff of air or water or food or sleep. And by that, I don't mean the late night working at a computer. I mean like sleep over 3 weeks, sort of bright lit conditions sort of thing. However, at the other end of the triangle, same kind of deal. I don't think that toxic environments should be called toxic just because they don't allow me to self-actualize. That, for me, is a little bit of an abuse of the term. I think self-actualization is an important part of choosing a working environment, but labeling it toxic because I can't be all of who I want to be, I think it's slightly too far on the other extreme. But in the middle, that's really where this stuff gets interesting. A working environment that causes you to question your self-esteem, that causes you to feel unrecognized, to have a curtailed freedom, to lose self-respect. A working environment in which your sense of connection with other people or friendship or intimacy suffers. A working environment where in bad cases, your personal safety is compromised. So you start seeing health problems. You fear for your job. You find you don't feel safe at work. I've worked in technology companies where I was looking over my shoulder because I was being hit. Now that sounds a bit insane, doesn't it? But that was the culture we were in. And in often quite male environments, often quite sort of bro culture, there can be a sort of larking about attitude. But it's fascinating to see how that can spill over into stopping people from doing the work they want to do and instead experiencing that environment as being deeply toxic, deeply uncomfortable. A lot of this is dependent on how acute it is, or how chronic, whether it happens in isolated instances or whether it happens periodically and over time. Nice article about subchronic toxicity. But I want to start talking about the perception, because as soon as we start to move beyond the how do we make this environment, how do we recognize this as a toxic environment, and try and move towards the how do we start to change this environment, how do we start to actually make it become an environment that we want to work in, and that's really the goal. Because I think this stuff's pervasive. I think this is almost everywhere. It's the change that we all take accountability for. Then a lot of it is about perception. Belief matters. So this was a study that showed that perception affects the impact of stress on the body. So if I think my stress is good, it turns out it doesn't do me much harm. If I think my stress is damaging and I experience it as stressful and uncomfortable and I want things, chances are it actually really will do me harm. And there's medical science to back it up. This is a similar study. This one looked at the impact of perceived stress on heart disease. And guess what? There is a link. And it's scientifically proven beyond a statistical anomaly, which is that if you go through a stressful working environment and you consider that stress to be damaging, it is, and it does lead to heart disease. Now this I found fascinating because there's an important point in here about the perception of stress. Those people who thought about it differently, who had different beliefs about the environment or different beliefs about the stress they were experiencing, had a fundamentally different biological experience of that stress. Such is the nature of the technology industry at the moment that there is a gender imbalance, and this, I'm sure, isn't news. I think that a lot of progressive companies are trying to correct that, and that's very important. Those companies are doing better than others. This is a graph that shows a little bit of the proportion of women in the workplace in different types of role. And as you can see, we've still got a long way to go. This graph really should be flat at 50% across the top. How long is it going to take us to get there? Well, it depends a little bit where you live in the world, but the graph that's not loaded is actually from the World Economic Forum and shows that the best case is that in the Western world, it'll take about 53 years. But that's good news, because if you live in the Middle East, it's about 350 years. This stuff isn't changing fast enough, and it will only change when we decide to change it, when we bring our awareness and start changing it. And so it's really interesting to know why we find it hard to recruit some demographics from society into the working environment, especially technology working environments. And that's where I've spent my career, and that's why I think this is particularly relevant. Broad brush, how many people in the room work in tech in some way? Okay, and we're talking at Leeds Digital Festival, so it's fairly comprehensive. I hope I'm speaking in the right sort of domain. Another graph didn't load. So this is a case of Susan Fowler, who is very brave, in my judgment, and spoke up about a culture that she thought was unacceptable. And this is what happened next. So a little way down the road, having spoken up about that culture, it led to a chain of events that really exposed how one company had descended, if you like, into a very toxic and frankly embarrassing culture that had alienated the women who worked there, and as I understand it, many of the men who worked there as well, and it ultimately led to the resignation of the CEO. Every time I get in an Uber, I think of this. Now, I wonder whether we can afford for our companies to be thought of in this way. I wonder what this did to recruitment for Uber. I wonder what this does and this sort of thought pattern does to the culture when we think about recommending our friends to come and join us in our workplace, and things like that. Toxic tech cultures, this was an article by Valeria Aurora and Susan Wu, and they tried to articulate what these tech cultures were and why they found them toxic. Forgive me skipping over a lot of this stuff, I'm trying to hold myself accountable to the time. This was a debate that followed on Hacker News, and Hacker News unfortunately doesn't allow iframing, which you couldn't show, but that was a fascinating read to see how people react to it. This tends to polarize opinion, because a lot of people are deeply invested in not recognizing the damage this is doing. It's much easier to paint over it, to whitewash it, to put up posters about how important our environment is to us and how much we care about our culture and how great it is here. But this pervades. I deeply believe that actually a lot of people in even the best organizations deal with this stuff, and the courage comes from those who are willing to speak up, do something about it, and who culturally within the organization are doing something about it, which is why I think it's so great that we're all here today. There tends to be a descent into toxicity. The warning signs are there. The way in which people interact tends to inform it, and I think we all start to get a sense of what's happening. Unfortunately, if I just skip forward through to these indicators, it's not always entirely obvious. In fact, I'm going to jump ahead to a slide 2 doors down, which says if there were a single metric for toxicity, we'd all know what it was, and we'd measure it, and we'd know which were the toxic workplaces and which weren't, and no one would work there anymore. It's not as simple as that, and if it were, we would have reacted to it already. The fact that it's subtle, the fact that it's not talked about, that's the thing that makes this more difficult. So we have to look for indicators, and inevitably when you put up an indicator, someone says, that happens in my workplace, but it's not toxic, it's fine. We all get along, we're great mates, you know? It's like going down the pub. And there's no arguing with that. You know, if it's not toxic to you, then great. Can you be absolutely certain it's not toxic to any of your colleagues? Can you be absolutely certain that it's not alienating in some way people who might want to work there, but don't because they carry some label, perhaps even a label they attach to themselves, such as being an imposter, that doesn't give them the freedom to go, well, I'll just go and do this, I'll be really brave. But instead they can feel trapped by it. And that's where it gets difficult. So I tried to mine the internet to find some of these, the sorts of thing that people have spoken about, and the sort of things that, okay, it's 2.5 minutes. The sort of things that people would look for and the sort of indicators that people report. The big one for me is the last one, physical and emotional health effects, and not often talked about. It will show up slightly in stats. It will show up slightly in the numbers of people taking absentee days, comparing that to the average, varying that and interrogating that against different demographics, but typically only in very large organizations. I started my career with IBM. At the time, it employed 250,000 people. When you've got that kind of number, you can pick out the fact that that one group is perhaps taking more days off than another group. When you've got 3,000 people, it doesn't show up. And when you're looking at a small team, because you're responsible for your squad or your directorate or whatever, and there's 6 people or 20 people or 40 people, there's no way to do it. In fact, it becomes very personal. And instead, you're trying to understand from a personal point of view, what's going on for you? Tell me about your problems, tell me about how you feel about work. But those are difficult conversations to have. I'm guessing that, thank you for the nod. I've always experienced those as difficult conversations to have. It's quite presumptuous to ask someone about how they're feeling and very difficult to get a response. It requires a lot of trust, and that means sticking your neck out and doing difficult things sometimes. So, it hides in a bunch of different places, and I've talked a little bit about some of these already. Jungian shadow I love. Jung talked about the idea of the parts of ourselves that we hide, repress, and deny, like our imposters. These parts that we don't think is okay to talk about, that we're worried that someone will shame us about or make us feel that we're not welcome about, or that it's something we shouldn't really acknowledge, or something that, frankly, we should just keep outside of work. And very quickly, the more of those parts that get left behind, the less of me is in work. And that's fine if I want to be a robot that programs a computer. I've done that for years. But actually, the most interesting bits of my job come from the other things I do. The conversations I have, the presentations I give, the other parts of me that when I bring passion and try to care about the things that I do. And funny enough, people don't care about toxic work environments. They don't become customer obsessed. They become pay line obsessed and just getting through retirement. Managers, this is what you can do. You can empower your staff. You can make sure that when you ask them to do things, you're not asking them to compete with other people. You're asking them to do things that will benefit their teams. You're asking them to do things that will help their colleagues. You're not asking them to do things where they're going to deliberately make other people's lives more difficult. Happens in some organizations. You can make sure by clarifying with them exactly what their roles and responsibilities are. Avoid the scenario where, because there's an argument going on at board level and 2 different teams have the same remit, they don't end up fighting it out on the ground as they both try and do their job because they're just doing what they were told. You can train them. This is not stuff we learn by ourselves, it's stuff we learn in the environment. So actually taking time out from people's busy working life and say, we're going to make it important. They know the security stuff. Can't be leaking personally identifiable information or stealing credit cards. We're going to make it important that they know about the technology we're using, because everyone should be able to understand the technology they're working with so we can all deliver as best we can. And we're going to make it important that everyone's getting support in their teams to avoid these toxic work environment and the behaviors associated with them creeping in. We're going to promote people. We're going to promote people not just on the basis of how well they deliver, not just on the basis of what tech they know and how bright they are. We're going to promote them because they're good at soliciting the kind of engagement and collaboration that makes these teams work. People like working for them. That's rare, but when you see it, it's inspiring. Giving to a lovely study about how one of the funniest most surprising ways to reduce stress is actually giving to others. So if you can incentivize a team to help each other, it actually reduces stress. It actually starts to cut into this kind of toxicity. And a bunch of individual actions. Now I'm just going to canter through these and then we're going to do questions. We're all leaders. We all make a decision to do this. Every time I make a joke at another colleague's expense, that's a hell of a gamble. That's a hell of a gamble. I might be right. They might laugh. It might not hurt them. Chances are they'll brush it off. But it's a knock. And I'm assuming that that knock is just going to mean they get back up and they get back up stronger. What if that knock's one of 80 knocks they've had that day, and they're so beaten down by the knocks they can't bear to come to work anymore? And my joke made me and the team laugh, and they hated it. That's what I should take to the pub and not bring to work. And I have to take responsibility for that because I like being the funny guy. It's great to make people laugh. It's great to be the manager who everyone wants to be around. But it's risky if I'm going to do it in that way. Fighting against it, talk everything about mental health, things we talked about. Call out the behaviors, but own those behaviors in yourself first. If I'm going to talk about anything, I've got to start off by bringing out my shadow, saying, look, I actually want to be the big guy here. I want to take responsibility for all your work. I want to go back to the board and say, well, haven't I done a great job delivering? But that's for nothing. It means nothing if the cost of doing that is that I hide that away and pretend to the team like everything's fine. They know it, they see it, but it just doesn't get talked about. It's that Jungian shadow again. Avoid humiliating people. It's very easy when getting into these things to start probing and pushing, and the consequence of that is that people get humiliated and shut down, and it can be disastrous. And embrace your inner crapness. I make all kinds of mistakes, and I make them all the time. Several in this talk, but it helped. Really understanding how weak I am in so many areas makes me much more accepting of all of our weaknesses, and it makes me much easier and more accessible, and that becomes something that makes for a more holistic team. Let's get through these. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Have you considered that your metaphor of going to the pub could actually be an exclusionary for a whole bunch of people?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, you're using it like fairly unconsciously, I think, but it would still fit into like there's like on top of like there's a lot of people who just don't drink and wouldn't want to.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you.
Like,
That's
That's
a really good reference. I don't drink. I don't drink, and I don't enjoy the pub. But I'm using it as a reference because I have to step outside of myself and try to find some middle ground. And I think the thing about a metaphor is that I'm just making, I'm reaching for something. I hope it didn't come across as like, I'm a pub guy and I'm so fun. Because that really wasn't what I was going for. But it's a fair point. I think like the other thing I'd say is that while I'm in your working environment, I'm not in my working environment. I'm here as a guest. I'm here just presenting for free because I want to help. I want to try things. So I would be, I suppose, a bit more careful were I doing this with my team. But you're absolutely right. It would need thinking about because it could be alienating. And that alienation, again, contributes to toxicity. Thank you. I think we've maybe got, yes, sir.
Why did you leave Skynet?
Oh! I thought I was going to get away with that. That's a genius question.
Be brave.
Okay. So when I came to Skybit as a contractor, I like the term contract scum. I know that's a really invidious term, it's really alienating for people. I was called contract scum. I like it, and I do like it because I made a decision. And that was, I'm going to engage with this company in this way. It was a very clear contract. There's a very clear thing for it. I did 6 months. My contract got extended. That was fantastic. And then there was a change in the unique way in which Skybit was funded. And the company went in a different direction, which meant that those of us who'd signed very deliberate contracts that finish in a week if something changes, are let go. And so I finished in a week and I was let go. And I'm absolutely cool with that. Which is why when I made the joke at the start of the talk about it, I harbour no ill will towards Skybit. I had a fantastic experience here, and I hope I haven't come off as bitter or mean. I think we've maybe got time for only one more question. If there's a risk, if you're thinking about asking a question, the chances are maybe someone else has the same one. I'd really encourage you to take it. Yes? Thank you. That's a really good question. For those who didn't hear it, and the future internet people who won't have heard because there's no microphones. The question was, if you're not in an empowered position, how can you make steps towards improving the toxicity of an environment because you're perhaps not a manager and you can't say, we're going to do this. I've wrestled with this one a lot. A lot of the jobs I do, I'm an augmented bit. I'm not coming, especially in recent years, I'm not coming in to run a team. I'm coming in to affect a team, to do something with it. And so no one reports to me. No one has a kind of a vested interest, particularly in what I think. But what I've found is that they care. They care what I think. I have a funny feeling we all sort of care what everyone thinks about us, to a lesser or greater extent, and that's a sweeping generalization, but I think, you know, it matters to me that people don't think I'm an arsehole. And there are policies run in, and across Silicon Valley, like this is a no arsehole workplace, which I really like. I think that's a great idea. And I don't mean to alienate arseholes, they should be able to work somewhere. But I think that I can listen, I can help people, I can take a little bit of a gamble that not doing the thing that I am being assessed on, but doing the thing that we are doing as a team and helping other people achieve that thing will probably roll back to me at some point at contract renewal time. And that is a risk. It also means a lot of the time doing things that are slightly away from the key activities that deliver value to the business. And that's risky because for me, I like to hope that there's some conversation you could have with your manager to say, look, I am noticing this, but I have found a way to counter it in our team by doing this. It's going to take me 2 hours a week. That's 2 hours I will not be cutting code or drawing architectures. How does that sit with you? And most of the managers I've talked about that have gone, wow, I didn't know that was happening. And yeah, and can I find a way to help you with that? And so sometimes it is taking that risk. And I'm very grateful for your question. And I hope that if you find yourself in one of these situations, you'll work out what your risk looks like. But just even noticing it, the point about realization, which made in one of the questions, I think it's so significant. It all begins with that first thing of like, we have the problem, let's all solve it.